The silence in my loft had a texture. It wasn't empty. It was thick, woven from the scent of turpentine, the hum of the ancient refrigerator, and the faint, distant rumble of a city that never quite slept. For 3 years, this cavernous space in a converted textile mill had been my monastery and my prison. I filled it with light and color on canvas, painting worlds more vibrant than my own. But when I put the brushes down, the quiet always rushed back in, a tide that left me feeling stranded. Loneliness was a dull, chronic ache I had learned to manage, like a bad back. I worked late, slept late, and spoke to almost no one. My life was a series of contained, predictable loops. Then, someone broke into apartment 4B. It was a sloppy job. They took a laptop and some costume jewelry, leaving a jimmied lock and a lingering sense of violation that spread through the building like a draft. We were artists, programmers, and freelance writers, a transient community that valued privacy over pleasantries. We weren't a neighborhood. We were a collection of isolated orbits, and the break-in was a rock thrown into our placid, separate ponds. A flurry of emails from the building management followed, full of corporate jargon and reassurances that fell flat. The final email announced a solution, a new overnight watchman. I scoffed when I read it. A watchman. It felt archaic, like hiring a town crier. What was one man going to do in a 6-story building with questionable wiring and 100 tenants who barely knew each other's names? It seemed like a measure designed to create the illusion of safety, not safety itself. I dismissed it and went back to my work, layering shades of indigo onto a canvas the size of a door. My world was paint and light and the familiar, comforting ache of solitude. I didn't need a watchman. I met him 2 nights later. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and I was taking out a bag of trash overflowing with takeout containers and paper towels stiff with dried paint. The service corridor was dimly lit, smelling of dust and ozone. As I shoved the bag into the chute, a presence behind me made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I turned, my heart giving a single, hard knock against my ribs. He was just standing there, about 10 feet away, perfectly still. He wasn't startling, not really. He was just there, solid. He filled the space in a way that felt absolute. He was tall, with a breadth to his shoulders that his simple, dark blue uniform couldn't conceal. His hair was short and dark, his face composed of hard angles and planes that seemed carved from granite. But it was his eyes that held me. They were dark, and his gaze was steady, unreadable, and utterly direct. He wasn't looking at me so much as he was taking me in, a complete and silent inventory. "Evening," he said. The word was a low rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the concrete floor. It wasn't a question or a greeting, just a statement of fact. "It is evening. I am here. You are here." "Hi." I managed, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the heavy silence. I felt suddenly self-conscious of my paint-splattered sweatpants and the fact that I probably had a smear of phthalo green on my cheek. He gave a short, single nod, his eyes flicking from my face to the door of my loft, number 5G, then back. He held a heavy-looking ring of keys in one hand, and they were silent. He didn't jingle. The silence was part of his stillness. After a beat that stretched just a little too long, he continued down the hall, his footsteps measured and quiet on the worn floor. The sound of his boots was a soft, rhythmic thud, a sound of purpose. I retreated back into my loft, locking the deadbolt with a click that sounded flimsy and inadequate. I leaned against the door, my pulse still fluttering. It wasn't fear. It was something else. A strange, sharp spike of awareness. The watchman. His name, according to the email, was Elias. I repeated it in my head. Elias. It felt as solid and quiet as he did. The familiar texture of the silence in my loft had changed. It now had a new thread woven into it. The awareness of his presence, a steady, silent patrol in the world just outside my door. My night owl tendencies, once a product of artistic fervor and a touch of insomnia, took on a new purpose. I found myself listening for him. My studio space was at the front of the loft, with large, single-pane windows that overlooked the street, but my small living area was near the door. I'd sit there, pretending to sketch in a notebook, and wait. His rounds were punctual. At 11:15 p.m., 1:15 a.m., 3:15 a.m., and 5:15 a.m., I'd hear him. The soft, rhythmic tread of his boots approaching down the long concrete hall. A pause. I'd hold my breath, imagining him outside my door, his unreadable eyes scanning the lock, the frame. Then the footsteps would recede. It became a ritual, a secret vigil. The building had a basic security camera system, a relic from the early 2000s. I discovered by accident that I could access the feed for the lobby and service corridors through the building's internal network. The image was grainy, black and white, and flickered with static, but it was a window. I'd pull it up on a corner of my computer monitor as I worked. At the start of his shift, I'd watch him sign in at the front desk. He'd review the logbook, his expression focused. He moved with an economy of motion, no wasted gestures. Everything about him was deliberate. I started to learn him in pixels and shadows. The way he'd stand in the lobby for a full minute, just watching the street before starting his first round. The way he'd test the handle of the main stairwell door, not just a quick jiggle, but a firm, steady pull. He was thorough. I watched him talk to a tenant who came home late one night, a young woman who looked nervous. He didn't smile, but his posture seemed to shift, becoming less imposing. He walked her to the elevator and waited until the doors closed. He was a protector. The thought sent a strange, warm shiver through me. My internal monologue, usually a swirling chaos of color theory and self-doubt, now had a new subject of obsessive analysis. One night, as he passed my door, he paused for longer than usual. My heart hammered against my ribs. I was sitting on my sofa, only a few feet away, shrouded in the relative darkness of my unlit living room. I imagined he could hear my breathing. Could he sense I was there, awake? Did he know I watched him on the grainy camera feed? The thought was both thrilling and mortifying. He moved on, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The next day, I found a small, neatly folded note slipped under my door. Front left burner on your stove appears to be leaking gas. Recommend you call maintenance. Elias. I stared at the note, at the clean, blocky handwriting. He must have smelled it on his rounds. A faint, cloying scent I had grown so used to I didn't even notice it anymore. He had noticed. He was paying attention, not just to the building, but to the spaces within it. To my space. The note felt incredibly intimate, a secret past between us. I called maintenance, and they confirmed it. A slow, dangerous leak. He had probably saved me from a fire, or worse. The next time I saw him, I was determined to thank him properly. I waited for him in the hallway, my hands shoved in my pockets, feeling like a teenager waiting to ask someone to a dance. He approached, his quiet footfalls heralding his arrival long before he came into view. Elias, I said, my voice coming out a little too loud. He stopped, his dark eyes fixing on me. Mr. Vance. The formal address was a wall, but I pushed against it. Thank you. For the note. About the stove. It's my job to notice things, he said, his tone flat. But his eyes lingered on my face for a moment, a flicker of something in their depths. Curiosity? Or was I just projecting? Still, I insisted. You could have just reported it. You told me directly. A report takes 12 hours to get to the right person. A gas leak doesn't wait, he said simply. He gave another one of his short, decisive nods and continued on his way. I was left standing in the hallway, my mind racing. A gas leak doesn't wait. It was so practical, so logical. And yet, it felt like more. It felt like he had looked out for me. I replayed the conversation a dozen times, dissecting his tone, the way he stood, the brief, unreadable glance. I was an artist, a man who dealt in nuance and subtext, and Elias was a canvas of the most subtle shades. Every small interaction was a brushstroke I collected and examined for hidden meaning. The meaningful touches began, as all things with Elias did, quietly and without ceremony. The first was almost nothing. I was leaving my loft as he was passing, and we did that awkward little shuffle in the doorway. His arm brushed against mine. It was just the fabric of his uniform jacket against my t-shirt, but a jolt of heat shot through me, sharp and startling. I mumbled an apology and hurried away, my skin tingling where he'd made contact. For the rest of the day, I was hyper-aware of that spot on my arm, as if he'd left a brand. The second time was more significant. I had taken on a commission for a large-scale painting, a triptych for a new hotel lobby. The canvases were enormous, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The freight elevator was, predictably, out of service. My only option was the wide, concrete service stairwell. I managed to get the first canvas up to my floor, a grueling process of heaving and pivoting that left me sweating and breathless, my muscles screaming. I was halfway up with the second canvas, wrestling it around a tight corner, when a low voice behind me said, "You'll scratch it." I nearly dropped the entire thing. Elias was standing a few steps below me, his hands in his pockets, watching me struggle. He wasn't mocking, just stating a fact. "I've got it," I grunted, my pride stinging. I gave the canvas another useless heave. It was well and truly stuck. He didn't say another word. He just moved. He came up the stairs, and with a quiet, "Allow me," he took the bottom edge of the canvas. His proximity was overwhelming. I could smell the clean, crisp scent of his laundry detergent, mixed with something else, something uniquely him. A faint, clean scent like cold night air and soap. His hands were large and capable, gripping the wooden frame with an ease that made my own efforts look pathetic. "On 3, he said. "Lift and pivot left. 1, 2, 3 inch. We moved in unison. The canvas, which had felt impossibly heavy moments before, seemed to float around the corner. We navigated the remaining 3 flights in a strange, silent partnership. He took most of the weight, his movements economical and sure. I just tried to keep up, my heart pounding from the exertion and his closeness. His shoulder would occasionally brush against mine, a solid, warm pressure that sent my thoughts scattering. We finally got it inside my loft. I leaned it against the wall, breathing heavily. I can't thank you enough," I panted, turning to face him. "I would have been there all night." "It's no trouble," he said, his eyes sweeping across my studio. He took in the paintings leaning against the walls, the chaotic mess of brushes and jars, the vibrant splashes of color. His gaze was different this time. It wasn't the Watchman's inventory. It was slower, more curious. His eyes landed on a nearly finished piece, a swirling vortex of sunset colors. "You're good," he said, the words simple and direct. It wasn't a compliment, it was an assessment, a fact. Coming from him, it felt more meaningful than 1,000 gushing praises. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Our hands had brushed as we set the canvas down. Just for a second, the back of his fingers against the back of my own. His skin was warm and slightly rough, calloused. The contact was fleeting, accidental, but it burned in my memory. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity. He had been in my space. He had helped me. He had touched me. He nodded, his gaze returning to my face. It lingered there, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. A silent beat passed between us, thick with unspoken things. Then, as always, he retreated back into his quiet formality. "Have a good night, Mr. Vance." He left, and the heavy door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the sudden, ringing silence of my loft. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, the spot on my hand still tingling. The quiet was no longer just an absence of sound. It was an active presence, filled with the echo of his voice and the memory of his touch. The slow burn had begun, and I was already starting to feel the heat. The barrier between my solitary world and his cracked on a Tuesday night in late October. The wind howled outside, rattling the large, industrial windows of my loft, a mournful sound that always made the building feel like a ship lost at sea. At 1:47 a.m., the lights flickered twice, then died. The entire loft was plunged into an absolute, disorienting blackness. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of my studio lamps, the low thrum of the building's ventilation, all of it vanished. The resulting silence was profound, unnerving. I froze, my hand hovering over a sketch I'd been working on. My initial reaction was annoyance. A power outage meant lost work, a reset modem, the blinking clocks I'd have to fix. But as the seconds stretched into a minute, a more primal unease began to creep in. The darkness was total. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The familiar geography of my home had been erased. I fumbled for my phone, its sudden screen a blinding rectangle of light. I had a few emergency candles somewhere, but finding them in this state would be a challenge. I was used to being alone, but this felt different. This was isolation made tangible. The building, usually a living thing with its own groans and sighs, was dead quiet. Then I heard it, a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. My breath hitched. Logically, I knew who it was. It had to be. But in the oppressive dark, my imagination took flight. The break-in on the fourth floor. The vulnerability of my old, wooden door. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the loft. "Mr. Vance." "It's Elias. Building-wide outage. Doing a floor-by-floor. Are you all right in there?" Relief washed over me so intensely my knees felt weak. "I'm okay," I called out, my voice tight. "Just dark. I'm going to open the door and check the space." "Standard procedure," he announced. I heard the jingle of his keys, a sound I'd never heard from him before, followed by the slide of a key into the lock. The deadbolt turned with a loud thunk, and the door swung open. The hallway was not completely dark. A weak, greenish glow from the emergency exit signs cast long, distorted shadows. Elias stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the eerie light. In his hand, he held a heavy-duty flashlight, and its powerful, concentrated beam cut a clean, white circle through the darkness of my loft. He swept the beam slowly across the room, illuminating my easels, the stacks of canvases, the messy table, before finally landing on me. I had to shield my eyes. "Sorry," he said, dipping the beam to the floor. It created a small, intimate pool of light at his feet. "Everything looks secure." "Thank you," I said, my heart rate slowly returning to normal. It was startling. He didn't leave. He leaned against the doorframe, one hand resting on the edge, the flashlight in the other still pointed at the floor between us. The main breaker for the grid went down. Could be a while, right? I didn't know what else to say. We stood there in the charged silence, separated by a few feet of darkness. The only light was the circle on the floor, a temporary hearth in the vast, cold dark. "Do you have candles?" he asked. His voice was lower than usual, softer. The darkness seemed to absorb its harsher edges. "Somewhere," I admitted. "In the kitchen, I think." "Stay put," he said. He moved into my loft, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. He moved with a quiet confidence, as if he already knew the layout of my home. I listened to the soft sounds of him opening and closing a few cabinets. "Found them. And matches." He returned a moment later and placed 2 thick pillar candles on the small table between my sofa and me. He struck a match, the hiss and flare of it startlingly loud in the silence. The tiny flame illuminated his face for a brief second, the hard line of his jaw, the focused concentration in his eyes. He lit the wicks, and a soft, flickering golden light pushed back the oppressive darkness, creating a small island of warmth and visibility. "Better," he stated, stepping back. "Much better. Thank you, Elias." I felt a ridiculous urge for him to stay. The thought of him leaving and the silence and darkness rushing back in was unbearable. "Would you? Want a bottle of water? Or something?" It was a clumsy offer, but it was all I had. He hesitated for a moment. I was sure he would refuse, that he would retreat behind the shield of his duty. But then he gave a slow nod. "Water would be good. Thank you." I navigated my way to the kitchen, my movements clumsy in the flickering light. When I came back with 2 bottles of water, he had settled, not on the sofa, but by leaning his hip against the armrest, maintaining a casual but distinct distance. He was still the watchman, still on duty. But he had stayed. He took the water, his fingers brushing mine. Another jolt. This time it was slower, a warm current instead of a static shock. "Thanks," he murmured. We existed in that circle of candlelight for what felt like a long time. The wind moaned outside. The candle flames danced, casting our shadows, long and distorted, on the walls behind us. He drank his water, his movements slow and deliberate. "Do you ever get nervous?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "In this building? At night?" He considered the question, turning the water bottle in his hands. "Nervous isn't the right word," he said finally, his voice a low counterpoint to the wind. "Aware. I'm aware." He looked at me, his eyes dark and serious in the wavering light. "I used to do security for a concert venue downtown. Big crowds. A lot of noise." He paused, taking a slow drink of water. "I hated it," he admitted, the confession so quiet I had to lean in slightly to hear it. "Too much noise. Too many people. You can't hear anything important. It's all just static." He looked around my vast, silent loft. "I like the quiet. You can hear what's coming." It was the most he had ever said to me. It was a small thing, a minor revelation about a past job, but it felt like a key turning in a lock. He wasn't just a stoic automaton in a uniform. He was a man who chose silence, who found comfort and purpose in it, just as I did. He saw the quiet not as an emptiness to be filled, but as a medium for information. A moment of softness, an unexpected crack in the granite facade. Before I could think of a reply, a low hum started deep within the building, and the lights in the hallway flickered back to life, their harsh, sterile glow spilling into my loft and extinguishing the magic of our candlelit island. My studio lamps buzzed on, flooding the space with bright, unforgiving light. We both blinked, momentarily blinded. The moment was broken. Elias straightened up, instantly reverting to his official posture. The watchman was back. "Power's on," he said, his voice back to its usual flat tone. "I've got to finish my rounds." He placed the half-empty water bottle neatly on the table next to the candles. "Be sure to blow these out." "I will, Elias." "Thank you." He just nodded, already turning to leave. He paused at the door, his back to me. "Your deadbolt is old. The strike plate is loose in the frame. It wouldn't hold." And then he was gone, pulling the door shut with a solid click. I was left standing in the sudden, jarring brightness, the scent of extinguished matches and warm wax hanging in the air. His observation about my lock was like a cold stone dropped into the warm pool of our shared moment. It was a reminder of his purpose, of the dangers he was always looking for. But it was also something more. It was a sign that he was still looking out for me, even in the smallest, most practical ways. He noticed the leak. He noticed the lock. He noticed me. And in the quiet, lonely landscape of my life, that was everything. The tipping point came a week later, disguised as the smell of burnt toast. At 3 a.m, the fire alarm shrieked to life, a piercing, electronic scream that ripped me from a deep sleep. My first thought, hazy with panic, was of the gas leak, of faulty wiring, of the 100 things that could go wrong in an old building like this. I threw on jeans and a hoodie, my heart hammering, and joined the stream of grumbling, half-asleep tenants evacuating into the cold night air. It was a false alarm. Someone on the second floor had incinerated their late-night snack, triggering a sensitive smoke detector. After 20 minutes of shivering on the sidewalk, we were allowed back in. The adrenaline ebbed away, leaving a sour, metallic taste in my mouth and a profound sense of exhaustion. I just wanted to be back in my bed, back in the quiet. As I got to my floor, I saw Elias at the far end of the hall, speaking into his radio. He was doing a final sweep, ensuring everyone was back inside safely. I unlocked my door and was about to step inside when his voice stopped me. "Vance." I turned. He had ended his call and was walking toward me, his expression unreadable as ever, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Glad you're okay," I said, trying for a casual tone. He didn't respond to the pleasantry. He stopped right in front of my door, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the lock. "I told you about this," he said, his voice low and tight with something I couldn't identify. Frustration? Concern? He reached out and ran his thumb over the deadbolt mechanism, a gesture so proprietary it made my breath catch. "The frame is softwood. The screws are stripped. A credit card wouldn't open this, but a solid kick would take the whole thing down." I felt a ridiculous, defensive bristle. "It's the lock that came with the apartment. It's inadequate," he stated, his eyes finally lifting to meet mine. They were dark and intense, holding a seriousness that went far beyond a simple safety concern. "There have been 2 more attempted entries in the neighborhood this week. Not this building, but close. It's escalating." He looked from my face back to the flimsy lock, and a muscle feathered in his jaw. "Management's official position is that the building is secure. It's not. The master key system for the residential floors was compromised months ago. A cleaning crew was fired, but not all the key cards were recovered. They won't tell the tenants because they don't want to pay to re-key the entire building." My stomach went cold. Every assurance from the management had been a lie. The illusion of safety I'd clung to, even after the break-in, shattered completely. "How do you know that?" I whispered. "It's my job to know," he said simply. He stepped past me, into the entryway of my loft, and I found myself backing away to let him in. He was a solid presence in my space, bigger and more real than anything else. He turned the deadbolt on my door, locking it from the inside with a hollow click. Then, to my utter confusion, he took my loft key from the small ceramic bowl by the door where I always dropped it. He slotted it into the lock from the inside and turned it, unlocking the door again. He placed my key back in the bowl with a soft clink. He looked at me, his face grim. Don't use that one anymore. It's a liability. My mind struggled to catch up. He had just locked and unlocked my door, a strange, symbolic little ritual. He was telling me my own key wasn't safe. He reached for the heavy ring of keys clipped to his belt. The metallic sound was sharp in the quiet room. He unclipped a single key from the ring. It was different from the others. It was long, dark metal, an old-fashioned skeleton key, heavy and intricate. It looked like something from a different century. He held it out to me. The key lay flat on his palm. It was a stark, undeniable offering. "What is this?" I asked, my voice thin. "The building has a secondary, older lock system," he explained, his voice a low, steady rumble. "For service access, boiler rooms, roof access. It's all mechanical. No cards, no masters. Only a few people even know it still works. This key bypasses the main floor lock and opens the service stairwell door on this level." My door, he paused, his gaze unwavering. "I'm the only one who has a copy." The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of his words. My door. I'm the only one who has a copy. He wasn't just giving me a key. He was giving me his key. He was bringing me inside his perimeter, into the circle of his protection. It was the most profound gesture of trust one had ever witnessed. He pushed his hand forward slightly, a silent insistence. "Use mine." The two words hung in the air between us, simple, declarative, and earth-shattering. "Use mine. Let me be your security. Trust me instead of that flimsy piece of metal. Trust me." It wasn't about the lock anymore. It had never been just about the lock. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the key from his palm. The metal was cold and heavy, a solid, tangible weight. It felt ancient and powerful. My fingers closed around it, the intricate head pressing into my skin. I looked from the key in my hand to his face. I tried to find the words to say, to ask the question that was screaming in my mind. Why? Why me? But no words came. All I could do was stare at him, my carefully constructed walls of solitude and self-preservation crumbling into dust. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for years felt suddenly, acutely painful in his presence. And in that moment, my face must have been an open book, because the hard lines of his expression softened, the rigid control giving way to something raw and vulnerable. A tear I hadn't even felt forming escaped and traced a hot path down my cheek. It was humiliating, a testament to how starved I was for a single scrap of human connection. I quickly swiped at it, but it was too late. He had seen it. He raised his hand, his movements slow, deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal. He didn't say anything. His rough, callous thumb brushed against my cheek, gently wiping away the evidence of my weakness. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shockwave through my entire system. His skin was warm. "Leo," he said. It was the first time he had ever used my first name. The sound of it in his low voice was a quiet surrender, a final tearing down of the wall of formality between us. It undid me completely. His eyes searched mine, and whatever he saw there seemed to be the answer to a question he had been asking for a long time. He leaned in, closing the small gap between us, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not what I would have expected. It wasn't hard or demanding. It was breathtakingly gentle, a soft, questioning pressure. It tasted of coffee and the cold night air and an astonishing, overwhelming relief. It was a confirmation of every silent conversation we'd had in the hallways, every lingering look, every accidental touch. It was the answer to why. A helpless sound, a choked sob or a gasp, was caught in my throat. At the sound, the pressure of his mouth deepened. One of his hands came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my skin, while his other hand settled on my hip, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against each other. I could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against my own frantic rhythm. I wrapped my arms around his neck, my fingers tangling in the short, soft hair at his nape, and kissed him back with all the pent-up yearning and loneliness of the last 3 years. This was not a performance. It was not rushed or frantic. It was a slow, deep, honest kiss that spoke of safety and recognition. It felt like coming home after a long, long time in the cold. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His hand was still cupping my face, his thumb a warm, steady anchor on my cheek. "Stay," I whispered, the word a ragged plea. "Please." He didn't answer with words. He simply tightened his grip on my hip, a silent assent. He led me away from the door, away from the harsh light of the hallway and the world outside, and into the soft, flickering candlelight of my home, which, for the first time, felt truly, completely safe. I awoke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through the large windows. The loft was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. An empty silence. I was alone. The space beside me in the bed was cold, the sheets rumpled but empty. Panic, sharp and icy, seized me. My mind, a traitor in the best of times, immediately began its corrosive work. It was a mistake. A moment of weakness after the alarm, a lapse in his professional judgment. Pity. He'd felt sorry for the lonely, pathetic artist who cried over a key. The thought was a physical blow, winding me. I sat up, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The intimacy we had shared, the feeling of his body next to mine, the quiet words murmured in the dark, it all felt suddenly like a dream, a fragile illusion shattered by the morning light. My eyes scanned the room, desperate for proof. And then I saw it. On my nightstand, next to a glass of water, sat the key. The heavy, dark, intricate key. It wasn't a dream. It was real. The weight of it on the polished wood was a silent testament to the events of the night. He had left, but he had left the key. What did it mean? Was it a parting gift? A final, practical gesture of protection from a man who regretted getting personal? Or was it a promise? A placeholder until he returned? The ambiguity was torture. I spent the entire day in a fog of anxiety, pacing the length of the loft, from the paint-splattered floor of my studio to the cold window overlooking the street. I couldn't work. I couldn't think. Every time I heard a noise in the hall, my head would snap up, a jolt of hope and dread shooting through me. But it was never him. The loft, which had felt so safe and full with him in it, now felt cavernous and mocking. His scent lingered on my pillows, a faint trace of soap and clean cotton that was both a comfort and a torment. I replayed every moment. The kiss, the feel of his hand in mine, the quiet way he had looked at my paintings, not with a critic's eye, but with a deep, still attention, as if he were trying to read the story behind the colors. By evening, I had worked myself into a state of resigned misery. I was a fool. I had mistaken a moment of shared vulnerability for something more. Men like Elias, solid, capable, self-contained, didn't fall for men like me, chaotic, emotional, living half in a world of my own making. He was a protector, and I was just a job, a problem to be solved. The lock, the key, the kiss. It was all just part of his thorough, methodical approach to securing a perimeter. As the sun set, casting long, melancholic shadows across the floor, I made a decision born of fear and self-preservation. I would give the key back. I would thank him for his concern, retreat behind a wall of polite formality, and go back to my safe, lonely existence. It would hurt, but it was a familiar hurt, a manageable ache. It was better than the sharp, terrifying hope that was threatening to tear me apart. His shift started at 11. At 10:30, I was standing by the door, the heavy key in my hand, rehearsing my speech. "Thank you, Elias. This is very kind, but I can't accept it." It sounded stiff and ungrateful. "I appreciate the thought, but I'll be fine." A blatant lie. At 10:58, I heard footsteps in the hall, but they were wrong. They weren't the measured, confident tread of his work boots. They were softer, more hesitant. They stopped outside my door. My blood ran cold. A knock. Not the sharp, official rap of the watchman, but a soft, hesitant tapping. 3 quiet taps. I froze, my carefully rehearsed speech evaporating from my mind. I couldn't move. After a long moment, the knock came again, just as quiet, just as uncertain. Taking a shaky breath, I opened the door. It was him, but it wasn't the watchman. He was out of uniform, dressed in a simple pair of dark jeans and a plain charcoal gray Henley that stretched across the solid expanse of his chest and shoulders. His hair was slightly damp, as if from a recent shower. He looked younger without the uniform, more accessible, and just as uncertain as I felt. His hands were shoved into his pockets, and his eyes, when they met mine, were full of a quiet anxiety. "Hi," he said, his voice low. "Hi," I breathed back. An awkward silence descended, thick and suffocating. We just stood there, 2 feet apart, a chasm of unspoken fear between us. He looked past me, into the loft, and his gaze fell on the small table by the door. I had left his water bottle there from the night of the power outage. I hadn't had the heart to throw it away. I forgot something, he said, his voice rough. But he made no move to enter. He wasn't looking for a water bottle. His gaze shifted from the table back to my face, his expression searching, vulnerable. "Is this okay?" he asked, the words so quiet I almost didn't hear them. His eyes flicked down to my hand, the one that was still clutching his key, then back up to my face. Us? The simple, direct question hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across the chasm. Us. He had given the chaotic, terrifying, wonderful thing between us a name. He wasn't running. He wasn't retreating. He was here, on my doorstep, out of uniform and off the clock, asking if I wanted this too. The test wasn't external. There were no gossiping neighbors or homophobic coworkers. The test was me. It was my own fear, my own ingrained belief that I was destined for solitude, that a connection this profound was not meant for me. The fear screamed at me to close the door, to hand back the key, to retreat into the familiar gray landscape of my life. It was safer there. No heights to fall from. But then I looked at him. I saw the genuine uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability he was showing me, a man who seemed to have no vulnerabilities at all. I remembered the feeling of safety in his arms, a feeling that had nothing to do with locks and alarms. I remembered the way he'd said my name. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But for the first time, something else was stronger. Hope. I couldn't find my voice, so I just nodded. A single, jerky motion. My knuckles were white where I was gripping the key. His whole body seemed to relax, a wave of relief washing over his features. The tension in his shoulders eased, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. I stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was the only invitation I could manage, but it was enough. He stepped across the threshold, and the moment his presence filled the space, the loft no longer felt empty. It felt like home. He gently took the key from my hand, his fingers warm against my cold skin. But he didn't put it in his pocket. He walked over to the small bowl by the door and placed his key right next to mine. They lay there together, side by side. One new and plain, the other old and intricate. His and mine. Us. The days that followed were a quiet navigation of a new world. We didn't talk about what we were. There were no grand declarations or defining conversations. It was all in the small things. It was in the way he started leaving a spare toothbrush in my bathroom, a silent claim. It was in the way I started making enough coffee for 2 in the morning without even thinking about it. His presence began to reshape my loft and my life in subtle, profound ways. He never stayed the whole night when he was on shift, but he would appear at my door the moment his duty ended at 7 in the morning, his face tired but his eyes soft. He'd shower, and I'd fall asleep to the sound of the water running, a sound that became a lullaby of safety. I'd wake up later to find him asleep beside me, his breathing a deep, steady rhythm that calmed the chaos in my own mind. He was a man of few words, but he was a powerful listener. He would sit for hours in my studio, on a rickety wooden stool that I was sure would break under his weight, and just watch me paint. He never offered critiques or suggestions. He just watched, his gaze attentive and still. His quiet presence was an anchor. It grounded me. My work, which had often been a frantic escape from my own head, became calmer, more focused. The colors on my canvases grew deeper, more confident. One morning, the loft was filled with the buttery, golden light of a perfect autumn sunrise. The dust motes danced in the sunbeams like tiny, glittering sprites. I was at my easel, working on a new piece, a landscape of abstract, rolling hills in shades of deep green and earthy brown. Elias was sitting on the stool, nursing a mug of coffee I'd made for him. He was wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and he looked so perfectly, comfortably out of place and at home at the same time that my heart ached with a feeling so potent it was almost painful. He hadn't spoken for nearly an hour, just watched me mix colors, apply them to the canvas, step back, and study the effect. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full. It was a shared space, as tangible and comfortable as a warm blanket. "That one," he said finally, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He nodded toward the canvas. It feels calm. I stopped, my brush hovering. I looked from the painting to his face. His expression was serious, his eyes tracing the lines of the painted hills. That's what I was going for, I said softly. He looked at me then, and the small, rare smile I was coming to cherish more than anything touched his lips. I can tell, he said. In that moment, I understood. He saw it. He saw me. Not just the surface, not just the artist, but the feeling underneath. He read the language of my paintings as easily as he read the silence of the building. He understood the story I was telling with my colors. His key still sat in the bowl by the door, next to mine. I hadn't needed to use it. I probably never would. Its purpose had changed. It was no longer a tool for entry. It was a symbol, a promise, a beginning. I put my paintbrush down and walked over to him. He watched me approach, his eyes warm. I leaned down and kissed him, a slow, soft kiss that tasted of coffee and the morning sun. It was a kiss of gratitude, of profound, unbelievable peace. He pulled me onto his lap, his arms wrapping around me, holding me securely. I rested my head on his solid shoulder, breathing in his scent. I was no longer an observer of my own life, a lonely man in a vast, empty room. I was here. I was held. I was safe. The dull, chronic ache of loneliness I had carried for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that emanated from the man holding me. Looking out at the sun-drenched studio, at the vibrant life I was painting onto the canvas, I felt a final, profound realization settle into my bones. This was it. This was what it felt like to come home.